What's up guys, Justin here with the CGEssentials.com, back with another Blender new feature tutorial for you. So last week we talked about most of the new features contained in Blender 2.83. In today's video I wanted to start diving into those in detail. Specifically I wanted to talk a little bit about the ability to open VDB files that allow you to simulate things like smoke and fire and other things like that. So let's go ahead and just jump into it. Alright, so if you remember, one of the things that was added in Blender 2.83 was the ability to import these volumetric VDB files. And so what this gave us is the ability to import things like explosions and smoke and other things that were created in other software and bring them into Blender and render them. And so what we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about where to get some of these files and then talk through how to set up our images so that we can actually render them inside of Blender. So there's a lot of different softwares that can create these. So there's two that are really popular. Houdini is one of them. And then the other one, which is the program we're going to use, is a program called EmberGen. And so EmberGen is a program that actually allows you to create these real-time simulations of things like smoke and fire and other things like that. So I will link to this in the note down below, but you can download this and there's a 14-day free trial of the program itself. And so if you don't want to download the program, you can also go to the EmberGen website, and under downloads there's some free VDB file examples that you can download. So there's like the building implosion, there's a simple fire, there's a mid-air explosion, which appears to be the one that they used on the Blender homepage. So you can definitely download these and import them as well. And you can also find some other VDB files on the internet that you can use. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use EmberGen in order to quickly export basically a sample fire, and then we'll import it into Blender. Alright, so one thing to note about this is I think you need like a GTX 1060 or above for this to run properly. I'm not 100% sure on that, but you definitely do need to have a decent graphics card in order for this to run at any rate of speed. But this is basically the beta version of EmberGen. This is what you'll get with the 14-day free trial. And you can see how by default what it gives you is it gives you this window over here on the right hand side. Then it gives you some nodes with different settings on the left hand side. So you can see how I can click on each one of these nodes and they're going to adjust things about my settings. And so in this situation I don't really want to change this too much. You can go into like your simulation and you can adjust different things about your fire. So you can adjust how quickly the smoke dissipates. You can also adjust things like your cooling and other things like that as well. So you can actually adjust these in real time. This is actually a really fun program that I would like to play around with a little bit more. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and we're going to leave most of these settings as is. And all we want to do is we want to export this to a VDB file. And so when you've kind of changed everything to the way that you want it to be, you can come over here and click on this button for Export VDB. And we can go ahead and we can export this to a file. And note that your number of frames in here is going to set how far along in this simulation this is exported. So you can kind of see your frames down below. So if I was to click on this reset button, for example, you can see how right now this is going to export 64 frames. Well, if I look at 64 frames, you can see how we're not getting a whole lot of detail in here. So meaning the simulation hasn't run very long, and so this doesn't fully export. So what we want to do is instead of doing that, we want to export a higher frame rate. And so you can do however many frames you want. In this case, I'm just going to do like 1,000, and it doesn't really matter what we do in here because we're only going to render a certain number of frames over in Blender. But you want to set your number of frames. You can set this to export your temperature if you want. Make sure that it's exporting your flames and also your density. And then once you're done, you can just click in here to set where you want to save your file. So for me, I have a folder in my assets folder for VDB files. And so you can just name that and click on save, and that'll save all of your different frames in here. So you can see how this one, for example, was 63 frames, but ours is going to export to 1,000 frames. So just enter a name and then click on save. And then we can go over into Blender and import this. And so one thing I have found is I've found this is a little bit twitchy over here in Blender, meaning I've gotten some different results depending on the VDB file that you have in here, so you are going to have to play around with some things in order to make this work. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to do a Shift A, and I'm going to go up and I'm going to add a volume. And you can see how in Blender 2.83 there's an option in here for open or import OpenVDB. So what we want to do is we want to go find our file that we exported. So I'm going to click on import OpenVDB. And I'm going to go into the folder where we exported our file, and I'm just going to tap A in order to select them all. You want to select them all because these are going to act as individual frames inside of Blender. So just tap A to select them all, and then click on Import OpenVDB Volume. So I'm going to click on this, and what that's going to do is that's going to bring in our volume right here. You can see how that gets brought in as an object. It also pops up a little option down here for properties about this body. So you can see how right now we have this set up, we have this box checked to import this as a sequence, meaning this is going to find all of the frames in here that we had exported. And I believe you can run into some issues if this doesn't have your frames numbered. So your frames should come in numbered from EmberGen if that's where you exported this from, so it shouldn't be a huge issue. And so a couple things to know when you're doing this. So the first thing is I have historically had trouble finding these files when I bring them in. That's partially because these are brought in over time. And right now at frame 1, there's nothing in here that I can find, right? So because the fire hadn't really started at frame 1. And so if I was to click over to maybe like frame 50 or something like that, and then zoom out, and so notice how it's still not showing up. And so one of the reasons for that is because at the moment we haven't quite set up the shader yet, so the material preview isn't actually showing anything. I've actually found switching over to solid view can help you find this. But now if I zoom out, what you're going to notice is I've got this fire object in here, but it's like super big, right? So it's way down here, and that's why we couldn't see it when we were zoomed in on our object. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select this, tap the S key to scale it, and I'm going to scale it down like this so that it's a lot smaller. Then I'm just going to move it up so that it's above my origin point. I'm going to insert a plane by doing a Shift A and adding a plane right here, and I'm going to delete out my default model. And so now you can see how this shows up inside of our viewport shading, but it's not really very impressive, right? Well, the reason for that is because we haven't set this up yet with a shader. And so what we need to do is we need to go into our shading toolbar, and we need to add a shader associated with this object. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the object, and then I'm going to go down here and I'm going to click New. What that's going to do is that's going to add a new principled volume. And notice that this automatically picks up that this is a VDB file, and so it adds a principled volume instead of a principled shader. So what you can do with that is you can use this to adjust what this is putting out or what this looks like. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to click over into material preview mode. And so if we look at this right now, you can see there's nothing really going on, right? You've got kind of this like dark area in here, but that's about it. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my black body intensity up to something like 1. And so when I turn my black body intensity up, what that does is it takes this and it ups the intensity so that we can see this a little bit better. So usually I end up putting this to 1. You do have to kind of play around with these a little bit to get the look that you want. But I'm going to go ahead and bring that up to 1. And in this situation, I'm going to bring my temperature down to something like 50. For right now, or even lower than that. Maybe we'll bring it down to 1. So if I bring it down to 1, notice that now you've got something that kind of looks like fire inside of this view. So if we were to jump back over into our layout view, you can see how now this kind of looks like fire, but it's very low resolution. And so part of the reason for this is this gets rendered based on your rendering engine, right? Like right now you're getting like a two-dimensional representation of what this would look like, but if you click over into your rendered view, you can see how if you have Eevee selected, it looks kind of the same, right? So we have Eevee selected right now, and so whenever I render this, it's rendering it real time, but it's just giving me kind of this weird result in here. So part of that is a resolution issue. So if I was to click over into my render properties, and we have Eevee selected, you can notice how what this is doing is even as I move this slider along, so notice how as I move my slider along, this fire is kind of progressing a little bit inside of our view, but it's still very pixelated, right? And part of the reason for the pixelation is because our volumetric tile size is set very high, and so it's giving us this kind of like pixelated look. So if you want to use Eevee for this, you can click in here and you can change your tile size to something like 4 or something like 2. And you can see how when I do that, this gets a lot higher resolution. It's still not like ultra high resolution, right? So Eevee just kind of gives you a preview of this. But you can use this in order to render this out if you want to. Usually you're going to end up going to Cycles for this though. So if we were to change our render engine to Cycles, notice that this looks completely different, right? So now if we go to Cycles, notice you're getting a lot more information inside of your view. So this looks a lot better, right? So as I click and drag this, you can see how my fire is kind of progressing. So it's rendering this as the frame progresses like it did when you were inside of EmberGen. And so you can take this and you can now render this using your rendering settings. And so notice how, and we'll switch over to Cycles for a moment and then go back and play with our shader a little bit more. So the shader is going to be where you're going to adjust the way this looks, right? So you're going to make changes to this shader, and depending on what we do, you're going to get different looks. So like if I set my density to 0, for example, I'm getting this kind of like, you can see how my details look completely different depending on how dense I set this to be. So you can see how if I move my density to the right, I'm getting more smoke. If I move my density to the left, I'm getting more light coming off of this inside of my scene. So you can also like notice how I can adjust my temperature, and so the lower my temperature is, the more this is like smoke coming off of this emitter. If I adjust the temperature up, it's more like fire. So you can see how as I adjust this up, I'm getting more of a fire look in here. And so you can set the overall color of this as well. So notice how as I adjust my color, I'm getting a different look in here. So as you adjust these, you can use this to kind of customize the way your fire is going to look in here. And so I think this is good for right now, so let's go ahead and let's render this. So the way that we're going to render this is we're going to go back to our layout view. We're going to add a camera. So we're just going to do a Shift-A, add a camera, and then we're going to hit the 0 key in order to move into that camera. We'll tap the N key and make sure that we've set it so that we're locking our camera to our view. We're going to zoom out, or we're going to set this up so that our fire fits inside of our camera view. Notice that I'm in Cycles again. You'd probably want to go to your GPU rendering in order to render this. If you have a decent GPU, it's going to run a lot faster. But two things I'm going to do, because this can be kind of time consuming. So like let's say we were to render this image, right? It's going to go through and it's going to render this out. And what you're going to notice is it's going to take a while in order to render this out, right? Because it's going through, it's doing all the path tracing and everything else. And so what that means is that this is going to be kind of a time-consuming process just for a single image, not even including if we were to export this as an animation. All right, so notice when it renders this out, the emission from your fire is actually lighting part of your scene as well. So you could use this as an object that interacts with objects inside of our scene. But one thing I want to point out is this could take a long time if you were to render out a bunch of these frames. So probably what I would do is, first of all, inside of my sampling, I would turn it down to something like 64. That's going to make your render a lot faster. I would also reduce the size by going into my scene settings, so that this isn't rendering out a whole bunch of extra space. I mean, it doesn't take a super long time in order to do that, but by reducing my resolution, it's just less pixels that this has to render out. And so one other thing I'm going to do to make this faster is I'm actually going to delete this plane out. I just wanted you to see that the light is bouncing off of it, so this will light objects in your scene. In this situation, however, I don't really want that, because calculating the light bouncing off that is going to make my render take longer. So what I'm going to do is I've got this set to a JPEG, and I'm going to let it go ahead and put it in my temp folder for right now, and then we're just going to let it render our animation. And so you can see how what it's going to do is it's going to go through and it's going to render out our scene, and every one of these is going to be progressively more fire because our frames go from no fire to more fire. So it's going to go through and render this out and then stitch it together into an animation. So we'll come back and take a look at that once it's done. So if we play our video, you can see how our animation got rendered out and all the frames got stitched together into a video. So you can use this in order to create different kinds of animations inside of Blender. And obviously your results are going to vary based on what your settings are, but this should be a good building block for you to start using OpenVDB files inside of your Blender models. So that's where I'm going to end this video. Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought. Have you tried this feature yet? Do you like it? I just love having that conversation with you guys. If you like this video, please remember to click that like button down below. If you're new around here, remember to click that subscribe button for new Blender content every week. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.